Welcome to Translation Confidential. This is Peter Argondizzo and Patrick Daley, and you're joining us for episode 125, Choosing the Right Translation Partner for Your Business. I mean, this is a tough title to come up with. I mean, really, I think that one of the things that I wanted to focus on here, Patrick, was, as the world gets more complex, as you have all these different options, different AI options, different machine translation options, different ways that you involve humans in the workflow, different ways to receive and send data. How do you maximize that relationship? So there's really like two pieces to this, not only choosing the partner, but how do you have like a more productive conversation with your translation partner? I guess if we go over that, that would be really good. So Patrick, what do we want to start with? Do we want to start with our Spotify Wrapped results?
Yes. So not only do people who just use Spotify regularly get that, we also get that as someone who publishes on Spotify. So it's pretty cool to review that. I think some of the highlights are our listenership went up by 18% from last year, which is pretty cool. And our top episode from last year was episode 113, which is What is Lang Ops and Why Should You Care? Pretty staggering amount of streams on that one, about 5 times more than any other episode we did. So maybe we should do another one on that.
Yeah, I think so. And that world's changing. And we're going to touch a little bit on that stuff today. So yeah, that probably would be good. My favorite one, and Patrick, I dated myself in the office. I said, oh, we're all the rage in Germany, just like David Hasselhoff. And nobody knew who David Hasselhoff was. So welcome to being old is what I thought immediately, but I'm glad we're all the rage in Germany. That's awesome. I also loved that we're a top 10 show for 42 of our fans, top 5 for 25 of our fans, and top show for 6 fans. Thank you, Mrs. Daley.
I was going to say, I know who one of those is.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Mrs. Daley. Appreciate you being a fan for so long.
I'm also hearing you miss me understanding all of the 80s references in The Office, is what I heard from that Hasselhoff story.
You are an old soul, Patrick. If it has something to do with a TV show, a movie, 80s pop references.
I get it.
Yeah. The sad thing, this is one of the points of this whole show is that on the eve of our 30th anniversary here in March coming up, I've kind of been giving this whole question a thought of how can agency and customer work together in a better way. But I mean, after 30 years of working in this industry and working in this company, one of the things that's really scary is most of our employees could be our children. So that's really sad. So it's like, how I try to like be cool and fit in, and it's getting harder and harder every year. So I need to work on that coolness edge, I guess.
Just don't sign up for TikTok. That's my only advice.
I've stayed out of that fray, and probably everybody's going to be forced to stay out of that fray soon enough. But
we'll see.
Mm-hmm. I am on Instagram though, so you noticed I didn't say Insta or the gram or anything. I won't do it, Patrick. I won't do. I know kind of my boundaries. My son keeps me in check on that stuff.
Yeah, he's a good gut check for you.
Yeah, 100%. Dad, no, don't do that. That's not right for your age group. Thank you, Ari. So great. So yeah, great Spotify Wrapped results, or Spotify Creator, the old Anchor, was absorbed by Spotify, and they provide that great data. Thank you to Spotify for that. And thank you to all of you for listening. I think we're going to have some exciting shows in 2025. We're really looking forward to that and continuing. And yes, we're going to continue with one season. There will be one season, and we'll get to 1,000 episodes, I guess. We're going to do. We're not going to do multiple seasons. So at any rate, so as I was mentioning, it is the eve of our 30th anniversary, and I've been far more involved in our sales efforts in 2024, which is really great because it's pulled me close to the customer. So I'm having really, really good conversations, and it also helps me as kind of a bridge between our dev group. So really have been thinking deeply about, what makes for the best relationships? Like what are the things that make for the best vendor to customer relationship? And you know, basically what are the things? And I really, to me, it boils down to trust and transparency, Patrick. I mean, do we respect the other company's initiatives? I think all too often in business we feel like, hey, I need to try to take advantage of the other side, and we've never run that way as an organization. We've always looked for, hey, what's best for both parties. And I think when we have that type of relationship and understanding with our customers, those are the strongest ones we have.
Yeah, I was thinking back to a sales training we went through back when I was at Argo, and the trainer framed it as, selling and working in a vendor and customer relationship. It's not a parent-child relationship where the parent is the buyer and the child is the supplier, and it's do whatever the parent says. It's really a parent-parent relationship. So that kind of mindset has really stuck with me over the years of like, it's not a parent-child. Like, it's not like client says this and you do it. It's like we need to have that mutual respect and level of understanding of like why we're all here and what we're doing. And that really has stuck with me over the years.
That's perfect, Patrick. That's exactly correct. Because, as a provider, right, we ask some questions that could be maybe viewed as trying to get a potential advantage. Like the number one question is, what's your budget? And I get it, because from, the old idea of a car salesman, well, what's your budget? It's 10,000. Well, look, I have a $10,000 car right here for you. Or even worse, I have a $10,500 car for you. I know you can afford this. This is a beautiful car. No, that's not why we're asking. So, and that level, that only comes from trust, right? So when I ask the question, or one of our team members asks the question, what is your budget? The reason they're asking is because we have different service levels. We have different tools that we can bring to bear. So, I mean, if you come with 100,000 word, technical manual and you say your budget's $1,000, well, that leads you right away to, hey, there's pretty much one level of service, and that's machine translation without a human ever looking at it. Good luck. This is going to be terrible. But what does that allow us to do, though? It allows us to say to the client, hey, listen, that budget isn't appropriate for that type of project. This is the only thing you can potentially do. Here are the risks. So it allows us to provide the honest, candid truth. If instead there's sort of this idea of, holding your cards close to your chest and not giving the information, it limits what the translation provider can do.
Yeah, and I think without fully understanding the scope of what a translation provider is asked to quote or to price out, like that can change things. I know we were talking a bit before the show of, you've run into scenarios of someone saying like, hey, can you quote one video for me? And then they get the quote and they're like, okay, cool. Now I have 100 of these. And it's like, those are two very different projects of how you would handle them. Like to get one video done quickly is one thing, but to kind of process out and workflow for 100 videos would be very different. And that's kind of, the PM will think differently when they're scoping that of like what the best process is, how to batch things. There's lots of things that come into play. But if you say, hey, I only have one video, like you kind of are setting someone off on the wrong path if you're really looking for how much 100 videos costs.
Yeah, and the worst scenario out of that, Patrick, is we have some conversations with newer clients sometimes where, they gave us very limited information. Here's a 2-minute video. This is what I'd like. I prefer to communicate, by email, so don't call me. I'm very busy. I'm hard to get, all those sort of things. All those tactics of, hey, I don't want to have a conversation with the vendor. So you follow instructions, you do the quote on this one language, and you quote translation, human translation, human editing, human voiceover with studio. You quote the whole thing, and they say, oh my gosh, wow, this is kind of pricey for this. But they don't even say that. They just black hole and go to another vendor. And maybe the other vendor is more successful to ask, hey, what is your level of service? What's your tolerance for pain? How do you feel about AI tools? What's your timeline? Hey, by the way, is this part of a program with more videos? So, I mean, it's one of those situations that, yes, if we just follow customers' instructions without digging down a little bit deeper, we might be doing them a huge disservice. I mean, you might have the cost for, per video, just throwing out a number, let's say that's $800. But then if you put a workflow in place to say, hey, I realize there's about 100 of these videos, I want to do them in blocks of 10. Well, all right, now you can put a strategy together and say, you can leverage some economies of scale. And without having that conversation, without having that level of trust and transparency, you'll never get to that answer. And, I would encourage all of you as translation buyers to have that conversation, to give as much information as you can. And if you feel that, if you feel like you don't, on first quote, you don't want to give up the budget, then ask to explore some different service levels and say, hey, I don't know my budget because I've not done this before. So if you could help me understand the different service levels and the levers that I can pull to drop my pricing down, your vendor should be more than happy to discuss with you what impacts cost, or what are the levers, or what are the line items that can either be, removed or mitigated. So
yeah, I mean, my wheels are spinning on this video one just because it's fun to think through all those details. But it's like, do you have an opening and closing bumper that you reuse on every single video? Like, you only need to record voiceover once, or translate once, or fill in the blank with whatever work you're doing on that. But if that scales to 100 videos, like, you won't necessarily get charged 100 times what it takes to do that front and back bumper. Like, if it's a easy pop and drop or copy and paste, like, that's easy. And like, your PM and your language service provider should recognize that and say, hey, this is something that's repetitive. Like, we can get smarter about this and a lot more efficient, rather than kind of just getting a quote for one and hitting times 100 and assuming that that's going to be your cost.
Yes. And even a project I recently looked at for a client, it was very unscripted. It was on a shop floor, and one of the workers was walking through a process of how to do something on the line. And I think, if you say to yourself, well, I have 100 of these, maybe even doing a little bit of editing to make the videos tighter, more concise, maybe using some on-screen stuff, or instead of doing voiceover, maybe just doing subtitles. Because that's a whole nother tactic. So again, all of that only comes from discussion. So, and as part of that, like trust and transparency, and, there's more to the global relationship as well. It's the whole global relationship. So, Patrick, I'm sure you remember, sometimes the intricacies of doing client review and managing that process and managing stylistic changes. But, how does that work? And how are payment practices? How easy is it because invariably it happens, especially in larger corporations, invoices get misplaced, billing people change, staff changes, bills are accidentally rerouted, or processes change. And then, as a vendor, we're not notified of that process change. That happens sometimes.
Your AP person leaves the company and they don't tell you.
Yes.
So your invoices go to a black hole.
Exactly. All those things. So it's, how is that handled? And even negotiations. So, a lot of our engagements start with an RFP process or an RFI process, where we have to provide information about how we do business. But I don't think it should be minimized that all of those things go into this larger relationship. And again, when you have this level of trust and transparency, you can have honest and candid conversations and say, hey, this is a little bit problematic for us. Whatever the issue might be, whether it's discussions on terms, whether it's discussion on contract renewal, or doing MSAs or SOWs to make sure that, everybody's in alignment on larger projects, all those things really go into that relationship. And again, if you start from trust and transparency and an open line of communication, all those things are so easily resolved.
Yeah. And I think something that people putting out an RFP or an RFI don't always necessarily think of is, I think during that time when you're fielding responses for that, there's nothing that says you can't do pilot projects with all of the firms that you're trying to work with. So like I know we always talk about dipping your toe in the water, but like pick 5 kind of easy projects that you might see that you have a lot of in the future, like send them to your vendors, work with them, like just get a feel for the working relationship. Again, like no one's locked into anything. Like if you're in an RFP, process. Like they're not set on their translation provider yet. So to me, like running a small pilot program can solve a lot of downstream issues. Like if you are like, hey, we're going to client review this one. What do you do in that project? Like just getting a sense of their workflow and process can save you a ton of time and headaches down the road.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point, Patrick. I wanted to transition back to, I think you had a note in your show notes about losing an RFP, but still working with that company due to customer relationship management.
Yeah, I think that's something I think in any as a service business is like I think people still value people and those relationships they build with people over the years of working with them. I know that even from the first translation agency I worked at, which was a very short time, only about 6 months, to the second translation agency I worked with, there was still overlap with people I worked with there. Then coworkers who turned into coworkers at the new company. So I think people industry wide really value those relationships, and especially on the buyer side. I know you've mentioned recently there was an RFP that unfortunately was lost, but that company still works with you outside of the RFP because of the customer experience that they get, and maybe they don't necessarily love the new vendor that they picked as part of the RFP. And again, I typically those aren't like exclusive, like, hey, big company, you can only use this one translation provider. Usually larger companies have a couple of translation agencies in the hopper. And it's like, here's our approved list of vendors. Pick one from there. It's not like you only can work with this one. So I think what Argo does really well is having the PMs also being kind of that customer relationship manager and being like right on the front line to build those relationships and work through any issues that might come up. Because I think, something we typically say a lot too is we can't guarantee we're not going to make mistakes, but what happens if a mistake does happen and how we respond to it is really what we hang our hat on.
Absolutely. I mean, as I've said probably 20 times across different episodes, if any translation agency, any provider, hell, any provider of any service says to you, we never make mistakes, that's actually when you want to run as fast as you can, because they're not really speaking truth to that issue. Is that their translation is complex. There's a lot of moving pieces. Invariably an error will occur, but how does it, just like you said, Patrick, how does it get addressed? How does it get documented? I mean, we have 3 ISO registrations. We're going for our 4th in January, our 5th likely a little bit later in the year. We really respect process, and errors are going to happen, but how we address them is really the key. And speaking to your point about the RFP, yes, absolutely. We did lose an RFP early in the year. And it was really kind of more of a misunderstanding on, again, the landscape changing and, us having more options. And the approach that I like to think that we take as a company when it comes to new technology is we're in it and we're working early, but until it's ready for prime time, we don't release it to customers. It's kind of the Apple approach, is what I like to say. Is Apple people will lament that, oh, well, they don't have this or they don't have that. Well, trust me, they're already working on it. They don't release it until it's rock solid. And that's kind of how we are. But what I would tell you is that relationships sometimes, will change. And the trick for us, at least, is to always act with dignity and class. And we were certainly sad that we didn't officially win the RFP, but we're still an approved vendor, and we still did more. We actually did more work this year with them than we did the year previous. And that's happened to us before with other RFPs where sometimes clients we had one client, we had a long-term relationship, was a 10-year relationship. And this was a tough guy. Like, he's one of those guys that when you chat with him, it's going to be a tough conversation. Tough as nails type of person. And for him to call me personally a year later and say, hey, Peter, we tried a few other agencies and they just didn't have it stitched together like you guys have it stitched together. We'd like to come back if you'll have us. That still to this day, in 30 years, I'm going to say that was one of the most surprising calls I ever received. And I was very, very thankful for it. So yes, we always try to, we don't burn bridges. We don't. That's not really how we roll, because you never know. People can come back and they try other things and it doesn't work out quite as well. And I think that makes sense.
Well, and I think too, another place where you have success is people will switch companies that they work at and take you with them. So like we've had multiple clients who have been contacts at multiple client organizations, and they're like, oh yeah, I've worked with Argo before, they're great, like I'm keeping them. So that's always something to consider too, and then they can be your evangelist within that new company of like, hey, I've worked with this great provider, have you worked with them yet?
Absolutely. That's been a big source of growth for us over the years and continues to be. And, one of my favorite clients has been typically a director of communications in school districts. And we're on his third school district. And for a little while, he was at an agency, and he brought us along as well. And I'm always super thankful that he takes us along, and, probably starting on about 20 years of working with him. So, yeah.
Don't discount the boomerang clients.
Yes, for sure. Absolutely. Well, this was good, Patrick. This was a pretty good show. I mean, any other points that you think we should make, or any big takeaways before we wrap up for 2024, our last show of the year?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to a point you made about like something not being ready for prime time, because I think that's super interesting. And I think we'll continue to see a lot of that with how much AI is coming out and advancing. Like where I work now, we write a lot of content for our clients, and that's always a question. It's like, well, why can't you just use AI and then review it? It's like, it's kind of the age old machine translation and post editing argument we've had for a while. Is like, it might be faster if we just start from scratch rather than start with something that's low quality and we need to bring it up to that level. So again, I think just knowing how all these tools fit in the workflow, I kind of had a light bulb moment a few weeks ago. I was like, someone's like, oh, how do you use AI? And I'm like, well, I use it to get unstuck. So if I'm stuck on something or something I don't want to do necessarily, I'm not super motivated, maybe I'll chuck a prompt in AI, see what spits out, and then that will get the ball rolling in my head, and I can kind of run with that rather than like just starting and be like, do this whole thing for me. It's like, it's an idea generator. It's kind of, but that light bulb moment for me was like, it just gets me unstuck from either what I'm not motivated to do or what I think will take a long time. And then I can kind of get the ball rolling with outsourcing to ChatGPT.
I just read an article this morning, because it's apparently sort of like the 1 year anniversary of the sort of the advent of ChatGPT going sort of, retail, if you will, right? Open for consumers to use. And they were saying the focus this year is going to be on sort of the agent, right? And it's sort of the idea that AI can assist in your day-to-day work. And I think your example is a perfect example of that, Patrick. And that's where I think I see our group really stressing the focus on AI in the coming year is, where can it simplify the journey? In fact, as an example, for a client, we just put together a little custom solution in Slack. And what they wanted was, hey, how do I stick an image in here that has, it's a screenshot with error messages in different languages, so it might be a Japanese screenshot or a Spanish screenshot. And my English agent is trying to help, and I have no idea what that error message is. That's a great use of an LLM is, hey, look at this image, identify the text, create a string out of that, create a series of strings out of that, and then you can serve it up for machine translation, right? So that's a great use of an LLM, and it gets embedded in a workflow. And I think like those are the use cases that I see that are going to be really, really helpful. Using AI tools for transcription, for first pass transcription, great use of the tools. And, I think really helping on sort of the tasks that just add so much time and complexity is just taking the process and chunking it down into pieces. And yeah, I love the unstuck for business purposes. I use that the same way as, I need to write a blog post, and here are my ideas. Can you generate an outline for me? Great. Well, and sometimes it brings things up that are not something you would have thought of. So hey, that's a great topic. Let me dive down that. And it's just a kick in the pants that you need sometimes.
Yeah, and I think just something I just thought of too is if you can serve it source documents like on the buyer side and be like, make sure I'm being consistent and like run like an English QA on it basically, which will again help you save on all of those translation costs if you are going into multiple languages. But I think that's even for like a content writer who's working in the translation space, it's like make sure I'm being consistent, like make sure this is easily translatable, make sure, fill in the blank with whatever, but that could save you time and money down the road.
Yeah, I mean, an idea that we used as well is we do a lot of RFPs, and we have a wealth of questions and answers that we've answered over the years, and we stuck those into a GPT and said, "Hey, we want to build a GPT that's able to answer questions about our services. Here's a series of 70 questions and answers. Can you learn from this material and help us generate new content?" And it's great. It works really, really well. It shortens the time for us to respond to an RFP. And I think, we'll probably do some shows at some point about some different ideas of different ways you can use GPTs to do that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Patrick, what's your big takeaway for today?
Um, Again, I think this is kind of even outside the translation space, but just I know we say it almost every episode too, but like having those open and honest communications of like, again, you can say one thing and set your agency down a certain path, but if they don't have the full picture, that could be the very wrong path. So again, I think it starts with, like you mentioned, trust and transparency and why that's so important. And another thing I would say too is any good agency would consider themselves a steward of your budget. Like you said, we're not trying to go the car salesman route of like, oh, what's your budget? 10,000? Cool. I've got one for 9,999 ready for you. Like right now, they're not just going to straight undercut by $1 or whatever it might be, but that will help them to tailor and pick the right level of service and tailor that solution for you. So I think like making sure that your agency is being a good steward of your budget is also really important.
Yes, that's very, very important. And for me, the biggest takeaway is that piece on trust and transparency, right? I think it all starts there, and of course, communication, open lines of communication feed right into that. I can't even imagine how many shows we've referred to how important that communication piece is. It's a lot. I'd say probably half of our shows somewhere in it we talk about, hey, well, communication is key.
Let's feed all of our episodes to ChatGPT and ask how many times we mentioned communication.
Absolutely. I'm sure it's very high. So for me, that's the big takeaway. And, I certainly value those relationships that we have with our clients. I mean, gosh, there's a couple of them that have been here from the start. They've been with us 30 years, and, even seen like the retirement of directors and new directors coming in. And, we've managed to stay the course as their provider. And, there's just a value to that. You can't even really put a dollar amount on that. So, yeah, that's definitely the big takeaway for me. So, well, if that's that, Patrick, I think we'll wrap up 2024 on Translation Confidential. So from I'll let you say it, Patrick, if you want. I'll let you wrap up for yourself. For me, I'm going to say happy holidays to all of our listeners. Thank you so much for joining us this year for another year of Translation Confidential, Patrick.
Yeah, whoever is watching these on video now that we release on video, you'll get to see I'm wearing a sweet holiday sweater. So I hope you enjoy.
I see that. I apparently didn't get the memo. That'll be twice in 1 week. We had a little holiday lunch here, and I also wore a black sweater that day. So it's not a comment. I just didn't get the memo, Patrick.
It's my last day on Zoom for next week. We're closed, so I gotta bust out my holiday cheer now.
Outstanding. Well, I'm around a couple days next week, so I'll get to right that ship. I'm in Monday and Friday, so very good. Well, thank you very much to all of our listeners. Happy holidays.